Hey there, welcome to Lesson 3 of Original Oratory. So yesterday your partner videoed themselves reading your story and the moral that they came up with for your story and gave you the video to watch. I want you to watch it one more time, and this time what you're paying attention to is how smoothly they're able to read your story. If they have trouble reading it, it may be a little bit awkward and it may be something that you want to look at to fix. It's not a major thing right now, but it's just something to be aware of, and you'll have an opportunity to fix it today in this lesson. So step one, watch that video. Make sure that you're happy with how smoothly your reader was able to read it. Once you've done that, then come back to this lesson and we'll move on. Okay, so I shared with you yesterday a story of my own about my brother and a time he jumped on a nail, right? I want to take a look at that again because I want to see if I can punch that up. So let's take a look at it again together. Here's what it was. When I was a kid, I shared a room with my brother. We each had bunk beds, but sometimes our parents rearranged our room so they were just two single beds on each side of the room. When they were in this formation, we liked to jump from one bed to the other, and that was a lot of fun, until this one time when we hadn't cleaned up the room. See, we were also in Cub Scouts, and that meant that every year we made Pinewood Derby cars. The thing about them is that the wheels spun around a nail that you were supposed to hammer into the car. But on this day, there happened to be a Pinewood Derby tire sitting on the floor between our beds, and the nail was sticking straight up. So on this day, my brother misjudged the distance between our beds, and when he landed, the nail went right into his foot. It's not bad. It's a good story, but I want to punch it up and see if I can make it even more interesting for the reader and if I can hook them a little bit. How I'm going to do that is A, I'm going to add details, and B, I'm going to figure out if there's a better order for me to deal with the information. So I'm giving the reader information in a linear way at this point. This happened, then that happened, then that happened, so it all makes sense logically. But I want them to come along with me on a journey, and in order to do that, I need to create a little bit of suspense. It's like composing music. If you think about a piece of music, you start with a melody and then you expand on it and change it a little bit, and then at the end you build tension and build tension and build tension until it resolves itself in a nice way. And so we want to do the same thing with our writing and speaking. So I'm going to change the details a little bit. So the thing is, I have to ask myself this question: what is the story really about? Is it about jumping on beds? Is it about two brothers jumping from one bed to the other? I don't think that's the point of the story, because that could be anybody's story. Every kid jumps on a bed when they're kids. Some of us still jump on beds like you shouldn't. They break and they're expensive. The point is, that's not a particularly unique story. What makes this story specific to me is what? It's the nail, right? It's the fact that he lands on a nail. And you have to understand, well, why is a nail on the floor? So that gets to the Pinewood Derby situation. I think that's where I want to start. So I've written the second version of this story. It's a little bit better, and that's what you're going to do today. But I want you to go through this with me so that I can explain what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. So if you'll take a look at, well, actually, before we get started, understand that I'm really good at this. I'm old. I've been doing this since the dawn of time. I'm pretty good at it. You probably are not that good at this yet. So don't freak out about it. Remember that it's really important that you just focus on the step that you're on. We're on step 3 of this process. Don't go to step 4. Don't think that you have to be better than you are. Don't give in to the negative sort of self-talk that like, oh, this is too hard, or I'll never be that good, or whatever. At the end of this process, you will be. It's literally my job to make you better than me at this. And I will. It's a sad truth, but you'll be better at this than I am. All right, let's take a look at the new version. When I was a kid, my brother and I were in Cub Scouts. So you see, I'm not even talking about the beds yet. I'm talking about Cub Scouts. I'm introducing the idea of the Pinewood Derby. When I was a kid, my brother and I were in Cub Scouts. That's when you're too young and inexperienced to be a full-fledged Boy Scout. Heck, you can't even be a Weebelo yet. What's a Weebelo? Nobody knows, but it's a cool badge. So you see what I'm doing? I'm not only changing where I'm starting in this story, but I'm also expanding it and adding details and jokes. I'll help you with the jokes, by the way. Anyway, we were Cub Scouts, and we were really into collecting those highly coveted patches that signaled our commitment to developing wilderness survival skills in the event that all technology somehow vanished one day. And back then, there was no more important wilderness survival skill than carving little cars out of blocks of pine wood. For the Pinewood Derby. Okay, I want to pause here and talk about what I'm doing. So, first of all, I'm not talking about jumping on beds yet, right? I'm talking about a story that relates to the jumping on beds, but the audience doesn't know that that's coming. It has nothing to do with it at this point. That way I take them on a little bit more of a ride. There's a curve that we have to go around in a second, and so that makes it more exciting. The second thing I'm doing is I'm trying to keep it very conversational. So you'll notice that I'm not using huge words. I'm not like trying to sound like this is an essay for English class or like I'm a professor. So that's important to understand as well. You want this to sound like you're talking to your friends. And then finally, I'm adding humor. Now, look, you may not be a funny person, but don't worry, because I am, and I will help you with it when the time comes. Let's move on. The interesting thing about cars is they have wheels, because that makes them easier to drive, or in this case, to drop down ramps. And if a thing has a wheel, it means it also has something called an axle. An axle is basically a cylinder that the wheel spins around. This is rudimentary auto body information that I only am kind of sure of. So I want to make a shift now to the story about jumping on the beds. So my audience thinks that this is a story about Pinewood Derby cars and Cub Scouts and things like that. But it's not. It's about being a stuntman in my bedroom as a kid, right? So I'm making that shift now. But if I mention the nail, if I mention that the axle of the tire is a nail, then at this point my audience will be able to predict what's going to happen when I start talking about jumping from one bed to another. They're going to make that connection and they'll be ahead of me. And so the joke or the punchline or the point of the story will not have the impact that I want it to. So I've got to sort of misdirect them a little bit. So I'm going to make a transition to the bed story, and then I'll reintroduce the Pinewood Derby part of the story. Anyway, and I am using anyway here on purpose as a transition word. Some coaches would say find a better transition. I want you to use normal speech. So I want it to sound like you're talking to friends. So I'm just going to transition by saying, anyway, my brother and I were really into the Pinewood Derby. We were also into stunts. So did you see that transition? So I acknowledge, okay, here's what I've been talking about. We were really into the Pinewood Derby. We were also into stunts. So I've made that transition, but the audience has no idea what's coming. My brother and I were really into the Pinewood Derby. We were also into stunts. Our main goal in life was to be a stuntman on the Dukes of Hazzard. Dukes of Hazzard didn't seem as problematic to early elementary school boys in the 80s, and really all the General Lee needs is a new paint job and a new name. Okay. So we wanted to be stuntmen for the Incredible Hulk with Bill Bixby and Lou Ferrigno. Point is, we were into stunts, and we practiced them in our room. We called it training. For example, we had twin beds that we pushed to opposite sides of the room, and part of our training as stuntmen involved jumping on one bed until we achieved enough momentum or velocity or some other word that is associated with physics. And we would launch ourselves across the room and attempt to land on our feet on the opposite bed. This was frowned upon by our parents, so we kept the door closed. Also, this was the 80s, so they were out buying cigarettes anyway. Like, a lot. So you can see what I'm doing here, right? I'm misdirecting the audience a little bit, and I'm doing that with humor and by changing up the order of the story. That way, they can't guess what's going to happen because they're trying to guess. Whenever you hear a speaker tell a story or give a speech, it's like you're trying to solve the mystery of the speech. What's the point? You're trying to think ahead. Where is this going? As a speaker, I don't want you to know where I'm going until I get there. I'm deciding what information to give you and when to give it to you so that it has maximum impact. So I still haven't mentioned a nail yet, right? I've set up the idea of the axle so it will pay off in the end. Now, all of this stuff that I'm talking about, like this is stuff that happens naturally as you practice it. It's not like I'm really thinking, okay, I need to do this here and then that there. It's a thing that I go back and sort of try to sharpen up on an edit or on a revision. But right now, just understand that like this happens naturally as you go through this process. I remember one particular day when my brother miscalculated and jumped far too high to make it across the bed. So by going too vertical, it meant you'd land somewhere on the floor between the beds. I remember being very impressed as he reached the zenith of his arc and started coming down. That's when I noticed we had a problem. See, there are two things you have to understand about what happens next. And so here I'm about to bring it all together. First, we were terrible about leaving stuff all over the floor. So in addition to the Star Wars action figures, G.I. Joe vehicles, and Legos, there were pieces of our Pinewood Derby projects, including the wheels to our cars. The second thing you have to understand, you remember how wheels have axles? Those cylinders around which the tire rotates? Well, in the case of the Pinewood Derby cars, the axles are in fact, nails. So now my audience knows what's about to happen. And this one was pointing straight up at my brother's rapidly descending left foot. That's right. I'm told the echo of his prepubescent scream is still reverberating around the town we lived in at the time. But talk about sticking the landing. See that joke at the end? I'm very proud of it. My job is to take the audience on a journey, and I don't want it to be a straightforward journey. I want it to be a roller coaster. And so the story is going to be told in an interesting way, in a way that serves their needs, not my needs. Like, for me, it's easier just to tell the story in how it happened. Like, this happened, then that happened, then that happened. But if that's how you do it, that's really boring. That's a boring story. It's the same story. It's identical details, but I'm telling it in a way that's just more interesting, and I'm adding humor. Now, here's the thing. If your story is serious, maybe you don't want all the jokes, and that's absolutely fine too. So now you take your story through this process. Don't make it harder than it is. It doesn't have to be as good as mine is right now. I mean, because, mine's pretty good. So just do your best. You want to think about, okay, how is it best to deliver this to an audience? What does the audience need from me in order to enjoy the journey of the story? Not just the story itself, but the way we get to the end of the story. So play around with it a little bit, see if you can add some details, maybe add some humor. If your story is serious, you can stay away from the humor, and that's fine. But see if you can just make it more of a fun story to listen to rather than like a linear progression of this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and see what you come up with. You can work with a partner. Just be sure to budget your time, because you do have to have this done tomorrow. You're not going to turn it into me tomorrow, but you are going to read it to me tomorrow, and I'm going to help you come up with some more stuff. So until then.